Throughout history, music has changed and developed into a multitude of different genres, styles, and presentations. From the early days of phonograph discs and single-sided vinyls, musical albums have undergone great change. With all the different variety that albums have, a question that I've reflected on for a while is one that attempts to give musical albums objective qualities. I wanted to find out why some albums were so good, and conversely, why some were so bad. Why is it that everyone agrees that the Beatles were so great? When the greatest albums of all time are discussed, why do the works of Fleetwood Mac, Nirvana, Michael Jackson, Kanye West, and Kendrick Lamar all pop up so frequently? Why are these artists better than the rest? What do they have in common that makes them the greatest of all time? To answer these questions, I came up with the following research question. Is it possible to objectively rate a musical album based on certain characteristics? If so, what are the common characteristics between widely acclaimed music albums? Before I go into depth about the question, an introduction to the concept of a musical album is required. Firstly, the definition of an album is a collection of related audio or music tracks distributed to the public. The first piece of music to be referred to as an album was released in 1909 and was Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker Suite. Traditionally, albums were typically between 30 minutes and half an hour. However, this depended on genre and where the artist was based. The differences between the three most common types of music presentation must also be discussed. These are EPs, LPs, and mixtapes. EP stands for extended play and represents something that is too long to be considered a single, but shorter than an album. EPs are also sometimes used as precursors to an album. EPs are typically less than half an hour. Album and LP can be used interchangeably. LP stands for long play. An album is a collection of music released on a single medium. Albums were developed in the early 20th century. Albums are typically the most important for an artist because they represent what the artist can do when they're at their best. Mixtape can be as long or as short as they want. A mixtape simply can't be sold for profit. Mixtapes are given away to promote the artists that they come from. Now that the definitions are out there, it's time to get into the meat of the question. Firstly, we must answer the beginning of the research question. Is it possible to objectively rate a musical album based on certain characteristics? A survey conducted in 2020 showed that over 60% of people believe it is possible to objectively rate an album based on certain characteristics. This statistic is also supported by the multiple different rankings of albums that have been put out by different organizations across the years. The inherent objectiveness of music is supported by the fact that despite these are all different organizations based in different areas of the world, all of the lists have very similar rankings of albums. So now that we know it is indeed possible to objectively rate an album, we must find out what characteristics an album can be rated upon. A survey showed lyricism, 24%, and production at 20% are by far the most important elements that an album can be rated on, followed closely by an album's theme at 13%, the overall mixing quality of the project 10%, and how experimental it is at 7%. However, it is also important to take into account what music critics look for when rating an album. Critics look for history, theme, cover art, flow, replayability, production technique, arrangement, and energy. For an album to be good, it must make you want to hear it again. This is why it must be replayable. An album's production technique is also important as it adds a lot to the listening experience. The use of samples, the mixing of the track, and how the instruments all create a better or worse album. Arrangement relates to how the song is arranged, the instruments and their positions, as well as the variety of sound timbres, all create different experiences for the listener. The amount of energy put into a song can often outweigh the loss from other areas if they aren't as good. The history and story behind an album is as important as it influences what the album is to be made as. If an album is made to share something rather than make a profit, it is usually much better. The theme of the album also relates to the quality. Often more deep and intelligent themes lend themselves to high quality albums. The cover art is your first impression of the album and something you'll see while listening to the album. If the art isn't good, it creates a negative impression in your mind. The flow of an album is also crucial as it creates a smoother listening experience, which makes an album much more enjoyable as a whole piece. It also makes the album's meaning easier to ascertain. So, from this we learned that albums can essentially be rated on 9 key areas. While lyrics is the most popular area looked up by casual listeners, it isn't as big as an influence by major reviewers. An example of all these points was an album that was the most popular submission for an objectively rated album at 36%. It is also the highest placed album from this century in the Rolling Stones' Greatest 500, as well as being second on Pitchfork's list overall, and being one of 2 albums to receive a 10 out of 10 from Pitchfork in the last decade. Kanye West's My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy is an album loved and adored by critics as well as the general public. To understand why West's album is so good, it will provide us an insightful look into what makes an album good. West's Fantasy is rated so highly because of the many different techniques and themes that he utilised in the construction of the album. Kanye had great energy and a theme because after the infamous 2009 VMA incident, where West interrupted Taylor Swift as she was receiving her award, claiming it was undeserved, stating that Beyoncé had one of the best music videos of all time. West revealed that Fantasy was made in an act of desperation and was a backhanded apology. West went on to say, "Let me show you guys what I can do, and please accept me back. You want to have me on your shelves." This desperation to be accepted back in society gave Kanye West an extreme amount of energy. Kanye was full of stuff to say, but nowhere to express it. During his self-imposed exile in Hawaii while recording the album, Kanye was not found anywhere in the public life. West used this album as a conduit to share what he was thinking. Another element of this album was the so-called Good Fridays, an event in which West released 3 songs each Friday from artists signed to his Good Music label. These releases acted as mixtapes for West's impending album. The widely regarded mantelpiece of the album is the 9-minute spectacle Runaway. The song is so well regarded because West rousingly highlights his own douchebaggery, turning it into a rallying cry for all humanity. Like many of his greatest songs, it's funny, sad, and perversely relatable. He references and acknowledges his flaws. "I always find something wrong. You've been putting up with my just way too long," he raps. This song is another example of how West uses his lyrical genius, as well as the theme and arrangement, to create one of the best songs of all time. Another highly praised song is the 5-minute experience All of the Lights. Here, West showcased his production and experimental process. The prominent royal horns and intense drums provided the perfect background for an extremely braggadocious track. Rather, West raps from the perspective of a deadbeat father desperate to make good on millions of broken promises. Kanye goes on to talk about his flawed honesty and the amount of unchecked power and influence given to people who have made it as big as him. West's Fantasy is an almost perfect example of an album. West uses the aforementioned 9 techniques extremely well to create one of the best albums of all time. Another example of a recently released critically acclaimed album is Kendrick Lamar's To Pimp a Butterfly. Butterfly is good in all the same areas as Fantasy. Critics rave over his lyrics, theme, and narrative. The main theme of Lamar's Butterfly is the mistreatment of black people throughout the world. This is shown most clearly on the song I. The song I opts for a live-sounding mix which samples the famous 1968 James Brown concert, which took place after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated. "How many people have we done lost, bro?" Kendrick shouts over the crowd. "It would be for us to come out here and appreciate the little life we got left." Underneath all the challenges and adversity Lamar has faced, Butterfly is a celebration of those who dare to wake up each day trying to become a better person, despite knowing that it could all be ended in a second. Butterfly is similar to Fantasy in the techniques that these albums use to become good pieces. Both albums, and all critically acclaimed albums, use the same formula to be good. These albums have hard-hitting lyrics as well as excellent themes and productions. The albums both have a rich history, with widely loved cover art. The songs just flow into one another and provide an easily replayable experience. The albums are also expertly arranged and contain great amounts of energy. Sound familiar? These are the same techniques that we identified earlier as being required for objectively good albums. So, to conclude and provide an answer to the question, is it possible to objectively rate a musical album based on certain characteristics? If so, what are the common characteristics between widely acclaimed albums? Yes, it is possible to objectively rate a musical album based on certain characteristics. The characteristics shared between widely acclaimed music albums are the lyrics, their theme, production, history, cover art, flow, replayability, arrangement, and the energy exhibited by the artist.